March 1945, Somerset, England. The cattle truck shudders to a halt beside a whitewashed farmhouse, and Hans Miller feels his bladder tighten. Rain beats against the canvas roof. Through a gap in the tarp, he catches a glimpse of rolling green hills, nothing like the images from propaganda films. No smokestacks or factories, just damp fields and hedgerows blurred by drizzle. A British sergeant pulls back the canvas and signals for them to get out. Hans jumps down, his boots sinking into the mud. He braces for shouting or the jab of a rifle butt. Instead, the sergeant gestures toward a nearby barn where steam curls from a kettle resting on a wooden crate. Tea's hot. Line up properly. Hans waits for the cruelty behind the offer, but there is none. The sergeant pours from a dented tin pot, hands him a chipped enamel mug, and nods toward a stack of bread wrapped in wax paper. Hans drinks. The tea is bitter, oversteeped and scalding, but it's real. For 18 months, Hans had been told what capture meant: forced labor in the Urals, starvation, execution, or worse. The propaganda ministry had been explicit. British camps were death camps with polite accents. He had believed it. Most of them had. Yet they surrendered anyway, some out of exhaustion, others out of desperation, most because survival was all that remained. They had expected brutality to be worked until they broke, and to see the British facade of civility crack the moment they became useless. Instead, they found something more unsettling: order. The barn smells of wet wool and hay. A medical orderly wearing a British Red Cross armband kneels beside a German corporal whose foot is blackened with frostbite. The orderly doesn't speak German, but his hands are careful. He removes the boot slowly, wincing at the smell, and mutters softly in English, almost apologetically, "Christ, mate, that's nasty." He cleans the wound with iodine, wraps it in clean gauze, and marks the man for transfer to the infirmary. No hesitation, no disgust, just routine care. Hans watches from across the barn, still clutching his tea. The mug's warmth seeps into his palms. He realizes he's gripping it like a charm. A young prisoner beside him, no older than 20, leans in and whispers, "They'll take it back. They'll make us pay later." Hans says nothing. He doesn't know yet, but he keeps hold of the mug. Months earlier, in the winter of 1939, the British government had made a deliberate decision. Every captured enemy soldier would be treated in full compliance with the Geneva Convention, openly, transparently, and to the letter. Not out of mercy, but because it fulfilled 4 practical aims. Security. Content prisoners don't riot, don't attempt mass escapes, and don't require harsh control. Intelligence. Humane treatment makes men talk. Bitterness silences them. Diplomacy. Reciprocity mattered as British POWs were held in German camps. Every Red Cross inspection in Somerset became leverage for access to Stalag 9C, and finally, principle. Britain claimed to fight for civilization. Descending into cruelty would betray that claim. So they built a system. By 1945, more than 400,000 German and Italian prisoners were housed across Britain, in camps, on farms, in work hostels. Red Cross inspectors made regular visits, reports were filed, calories tracked, and camp commandants who violated policy were reassigned. The mortality rate among Axis POWs in British hands was less than 1%. Most deaths from wounds or disease contracted before capture. It wasn't propaganda, it was procedure, enforced through bureaucracy, that most unglamorous form of restraint. Hans knew none of this yet. All he knew was that the tea was real, and no one had struck him. Camp 174. Tata district, a requisitioned estate converted into neat rows of Nissen huts behind barbed wire. The registration officer spoke halting German learned from a phrase book and 3 months of practice. Name, rank, serial number, medical condition. Hans complied. His Omega watch, a gift from his father, was logged and sealed in an envelope with his name in careful block letters. He was told he'd get it back when the war ended. Assigned to Hut 7, Bunk 14, he found a straw-filled mattress and a rough wool blanket, both scratchy but clean. Inside the hut, a pot-belly stove radiates warmth and firewood is stacked neatly outside. At 1800 hours, a whistle blows for dinner. The mess hall is a long wooden building filled with the scent of boiled potatoes and cabbage. The queue shuffles forward. Each man receives a tin plate, a ladle of mutton stew with carrots and turnips, 2 slices of brown bread with margarine, and a mug of tea. Hans eats cautiously, expecting some hidden cruelty or taint. There's none. Across the table, an older prisoner, Sergeant Klaus, a veteran of North Africa, sets down his spoon and begins to weep silently. No one mocks him. No one speaks. They all understand. By April, Hans joins a 15-man work detail assigned to a dairy farm 3 miles away. They leave at 06:30 under the supervision of Corporal Davies, a Welshman with a limp from Dunkirk and no patience for nonsense. You muck the stalls, mend the fences, help with the milking. Work hard, you'll be treated fair. Slack off, and you'll stay in the hut with no extras. Claire. The work is demanding, harder than garrison duty, easier than the Eastern Front. The hours are long but manageable. 8 a day, 6 days a week, with Sundays off. The farmer, Mr. Hancock, 60 and wiry, has 2 sons, one in Burma, one lost at Caen. He rarely smiles, but he never spits either. When the prisoners finish milking early, he silently brings out a jug of cider and tin cups, pouring for everyone without a word. Hans tastes apples and autumn. Hancock gives a brief nod. Right then. That's all. Yet the next week, the bread ration at the farm grows slightly thicker, an unspoken acknowledgement. You've earned it. The nearby village lies half a mile down the road. Prisoners can't enter it unsupervised, but on Sundays, locals visit the farm to trade or deliver mending. Mrs. Pritchard, a widow in her late 50s with hands like oak roots, is the first to speak to Hans. She sets down a basket of socks needing darning near the barn, where he's oiling a harness. You're the one from Bavaria, aren't you? Yes, ma'am. Thought so. My husband's cousin lived in Munich before the war. Lovely city. She doesn't linger. The following week, she collects the mended socks and leaves a small jar of jam with no label. That night, Hans spreads it on bread. It tastes of strawberries and something uncomfortably close to forgiveness. By summer, trust grows quietly. Guards stop pacing the perimeter so often. Prisoners sit outside in the evenings. A football appears, and games spring up in the yard, sometimes joined by British guards who play with sleeves rolled up in fierce concentration. One afternoon, Hancock tosses Hans the tractor keys. Ever driven one? Yes. Good. North Field needs harrowing. I'll be in the house. Don't make me regret this. Hans drives alone. No guard, no fence. He could flee, but he doesn't. He finishes the work, parks the tractor, and returns the keys. Hancock checks the fuel gauge and grunts. Good lad. Hans, a 27-year-old Wehrmacht soldier, hears those words and isn't sure whether to laugh or cry. In June, dysentery sweeps through Hut 9. The camp doctor, Captain Ellison, too old for combat, too skilled to retire, treats German prisoners with the same brisk efficiency he gives British troops. Hydration salts, quarantines, burned mattresses replaced with new ones. One feverish soldier mutters in German about his mother. Ellison doesn't understand, but he sits beside the man for 20 minutes, checks his pulse, adjusts the blanket and murmurs, "You'll be all right, son." The man recovers. Others notice. Statistics are cold, but they matter. Of the 400,000 Axis POWs held in Britain, fewer than 1 in 200 died in custody, a 0.3% mortality rate, mostly from pre-existing wounds or illness. The British Medical Corps treated enemy wounded as patients, not foes. It wasn't mercy. It was medicine. It was policy. Civilization holding the line when cruelty would have been easier. Hans watches Ellison leave, black bag in hand, thinking, if they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. They don't want us dead. They want us managed. Christmas 1945. The war in Europe has been over 7 months, but repatriation drags on. Hans and 200 other Germans remain at Camp 174, waiting for transport home to a country that no longer exists as they remember it. The camp chaplain, Father Hennessy, an Irish Catholic with a round face and calm eyes, organizes a joint Christmas service. Attendance isn't mandatory. Hans goes. The hymn is Silent Night, sung first in English, then in German. The British Guards stand at the back, caps in hand. A few sing along, poorly but sincerely. Afterward, the chaplain hands out cigarettes, players 10 per man, and a tin of short bread. No sermon, no lecture, just Merry Christmas, lads. Hans steps outside and lights his cigarette, watching the snow drift over Somerset. A young guard, Private Bennett from Devon, leans against the hut and lights his own. Funny old war, innit? Hans nods. Funny old war. They smoke quietly, the snow still drifting down. Far off, a church bell tolls through the frozen air. In January 1946, Hans writes a letter to his mother in Bavaria. It passes through the camp censor, a tired lieutenant who finds nothing to black out. Dear Mutti, I am well. The food is plain but enough. I work on a farm. The people are fair. I do not know when I will return, but I am safe. Do not believe what you hear about the camps. It isn't true. I am treated as a prisoner, not an animal. I think of you every day. Hans! His mother receives the letter 3 weeks later. She reads it twice, crying softly, and shows it to Frau Dietrich, her neighbor, whose son vanished somewhere in Russia. Frau Dietrich reads it and murmurs, "Perhaps we were lied to about more than we knew." The thought spreads quietly from house to house like a ripple in still water. The camp's library is a converted storage shed, its shelves lined with donated books, English novels, technical manuals, and a few German texts supplied by the Red Cross. Prisoners are allowed 2 hours of access each evening. Hans reads David Copperfield slowly, dictionary in hand. He never finishes it before repatriation, but he never forgets the opening line. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. A music club takes shape. 3 prisoners combine their talents. One plays harmonica, another sings, and the third beats a makeshift drum of tin and canvas. They perform in the mess hall on Saturday nights. The guards attend too. Applause is polite, restrained, but no one leaves early. A former Hamburg school teacher begins offering English lessons to those who want to learn. Some join, others don't. Those who do are already thinking beyond the fences, toward a future where language might be a bridge rather than a barrier. These are small liberties, modest by any measure, but in a camp built for containment, A library and a classroom are quiet acts of faith. They suggest you're expected to have a future. Rules exist, and breaking them has consequences. In August, a prisoner is caught stealing bread from the mess. Not for himself, but for a sick friend who can't eat. The report is filed. The punishment: 3 days of reduced rations and confinement. Sergeant Willis, the guard delivering the verdict, looks uneasy. You understand why? Yes. Good. Don't do it again. If your friend needs food, tell the doctor. That's his job. A month later, another guard loses his temper and shoves a prisoner moving too slowly at roll call. The man stumbles but doesn't fall. Another guard reports the incident. The offender is reassigned to desk duty and formally reprimanded. The camp commandant gathers everyone and addresses them in German. That behavior is unacceptable. It will not happen again. Hans watches, astonished. They discipline their own, he thinks. The message is unmistakable. The wire is the punishment. The guards are not. It happens gradually, then suddenly. One warm evening late in summer, Hans sits outside mending a boot and realizes he can't recall the last time he felt afraid. Not of the guards, not of the camp, not even of the locals. His fear now is of going home, of what he'll find, who will remain, whether Germany even exists as he knew it. But in this camp, in this quiet patch of Somerset, he feels something he hasn't known since 1939. Safety. The realization is unbearable. If the propaganda lied about this, about the camps, the treatment, the supposed extermination awaiting every captured soldier, what else was a lie? What else had they believed? What else had they done? The questions take root and never leave him. Years later, in a letter to a British journalist researching POW experiences, Hans writes, "I was not grateful to be captured. I was grateful to survive, and to see, if only once, what decency looked like when the world had forgotten it. I felt a deep shame for having survived when so many others did not. Yet the British never took advantage of that guilt. They did not condemn me for living. They simply kept me, fed me, and released me when the war ended. That, in its quiet way, was the hardest mercy to bear, being forced to live and face what I had been part of. They gave me no reason to hate them, and then that, I realized, was deliberate." By 1946, repatriation began in earnest. Trains and lorries carried prisoners back to a Germany broken in body and spirit, divided, ruined, and barely recognizable. Some returned eagerly, others reluctantly. A few asked to stay, and the British allowed it under strict conditions. Former POWs who wished to remain for farm or reconstruction work could apply for temporary labor permits. A few hundred did. They worked the same fields, the same barns, but now for wages instead of under guard. Hans remained until 1948, earning modest pay at Hancock's farm. Small, but enough to send money home to his mother. He learned fluent English. He married a local woman, Emily, a nurse and the niece of Mrs. Pritchard, who didn't care that he had once been the enemy. In 1952, they emigrated to Canada. Hans never went back to Germany. Yet every Christmas until Hancock's death in 1971, they exchanged cards, brief, practical notes written with quiet affection. "Hope you're well. Farm's still standing. Kids are grown. Tractor finally died. Good luck with the new one." It was simple. It was enough. When historians write of the Second World War, they count the dead, the displaced, the destroyed. They record battles, atrocities, and the fall of empires. Rarely do they pause for the small relics of peace, but Hans kept his. An old, chipped enamel mug from that first afternoon in Somerset, the one filled with bitter, scalding tea by a British sergeant without malice or ceremony. It was camp property, technically, but when Hans left in 1948, he slipped it into his rucksack. No one stopped him. 70 years later, it rests in a glass cabinet in his home in Ontario. His grandchildren sometimes ask about it, and he tells them, "It was the first thing I was given that I didn't have to fight for." He explains that Britain hadn't won the war with tea and bread. They won it with steel, blood, and the unyielding courage of millions who never came home. But they won the peace, their quiet, Somerset-sized share of it, with something simpler. By proving that restraint was not weakness, that order was not cruelty, and that treating the enemy as human did not mean forgiving his crimes. The barbed wire was punishment. The tea was policy. The mug was proof. Hans had expected enslavement. Instead, he found structure, food, and choice. The greatest shock of all was to be treated as though he still mattered when he himself no longer believed it. True strength, he would say, is restraint, and civilization is the courage to show it when cruelty would be easier. Hans learned that lesson in a rain-soaked barn in Somerset, holding a tin mug of bitter, oversteeped tea that, for the first time in years, was real.